Gahn creates a catalog of musical characteristics commonly associated with American minimal music in an attempt to discern which are the most definitive of the style. For him, the most important characteristic is audible structure. Quote, their structure was right on the surface, that you could tell just from listening, often from the first audition, what the overall process was. It seemed to me that part of minimalism's early mystique was to have no secrets, to hold the music structure right in the audience's face and have that be listened to, end quote. For an entire generation of composers, minimalism had a powerful impact. In the late 60s and early 70s, when universities were preoccupied with the study of post-World War II avant-garde music, like serialism, minimalism seemed to offer hope to a generation of composers who wished to write music that was sophisticated enough for academia, but would still be enjoyable for non-specialist audiences. The works of Terry Riley, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and others opened the door for a generation of young composers to write art music that would not live and die inside the walls of academia. David Lang was one of those composers. In an interview with The Guardian in 2016, when asked what the best new piece written in the last 50 years was, Lang replied, "For me, it has to be either Philip Glass's Einstein on the Beach or Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians. I can't pick." However, although the minimalist had a prominent influence on Lang, he approaches musical process very differently than either Reich or Glass. In an interview with Andrew Bliss, he says, quote, I think one of the interesting things about working with patterns is there's a way in which they're sort of universal. You start them up and they run themselves. If that's all you're doing, where's the authenticity? Where am I in that process? So where minimalist composers like Reich simply establish the process and let them run themselves, Lang needs to interfere. He subjects all of his processes to glitches. In the same interview, he adds, quote, I think the music is where the glitches are. It's how the things don't work. It's how the math almost works. In Cheating, Lying, Stealing, there are several different ways that I try this. The beginning is, of course, this expansion pattern that at one moment I just decide I don't like the rhythm in that measure, I'm skipping it. The last section, it's two mathematical patterns in collision with each other. So it's not about math and purity, it's about how I've used these patterns like a demolition derby or something, and that's where the music is. An examination of the expansion process that Lang mentions at the beginning of Cheating, Lying, Stealing will demonstrate how the composer manipulates musical processes in this piece. The first major section is based around a simple motif of 3 pairs of notes. This set of 3 note pairs re-enters over and over in strict periodic entrances and separated by a few seconds of silence each time. And this forms the basis of the process that will govern the structure of the entire first section. After the initial presentation of the motive, what Lang referred to as an expansion process begins. So on the next entrance, the entire motive, these 3 pairs of notes, are augmented by a gap that's been inserted in the middle of the first pair. On successive entrances, the gap is relocated to split up the second pair and then the third pair. The constantly changing position of the gap, combined with these strictly periodic entrances, results in a fascinatingly complicated aural experience that Bliss refers to as metric superimposition, which basically means the listener shifts his perception of where the beat is. It's hard to figure out exactly where the beat is. Once Lang presents every iteration with 1 gap, so he splits up the first pair, then the second pair, then the third pair, he then repeats the process now with 2 gaps. But instead of splitting up the first and second pair, as one might expect, he starts with the first and the third pair, then the first and second pair, and then finally the second and third pair. So he systematically works through every possibility that has 2 gaps. So again, every element of this section, even though he's using a process, is created to create uncertainty. It's designed to create uncertainty for the listener and not the predictable motoric processes that minimalist composers use. Finally, after the 3 iterations with 2 gaps are presented, Lang presents the motive with a gap between all 3 pairs, which is, of course, the logical conclusion to this process, right? If we do every common possibility with 1 pair, every possibility with 2 pair, now we have a gap between all 3 pairs. However, there's one essential modification at this point. At this point, there's no silence before the next iteration of the motive. Instead, there's what I call a contraction, after his use of the term expansion, glitch. There's no silence. It goes immediately to a new variation of the motive, but with 4 pairs of notes instead of 3. And this contraction or glitch is critical to the structure of the entire piece. In fact, it does not get resolved until the very end, almost 9 minutes later. Therefore, this glitch is referred to as a structural glitch because it marks a formal boundary in the music before the next augmentation or variation of the motive, and because its presence has deep ramifications for the structure of the entire piece. Each of the 3 major sections of this piece contain their own processes that are subjected to their own structural and non-structural glitches. But this particular glitch is not only the first one that presents itself, it's also the only one that the composer corrects later in the piece. Now, once the expanded version of the motive, so now containing 4 pairs of notes, is presented, this same process begins again. He introduces a gap in the first pair, then the second pair, then the third pair, then the fourth pair, then starts going through the combinations with 2 gaps, then 3 gaps. However, when this process begins, there's almost immediately a glitch, yet another glitch. So when there should be a gap separating the third pair, so splits up the first pair, splits up the second pair, when there should be a gap separating the third pair, he instead repeats the previous one, the gap with the second pair, and then moves directly to the gap in the fourth pair. And in this case, Lang has already admitted the motive behind this decision. Quote from Bliss, the beginning is, of course, this expansion pattern that at one moment I just decide I don't like the rhythm in that measure, I'm skipping it. Now, because this glitch does not contain any further structural ramifications, but is simply an anomaly born out of the composer's dislike of a particular rhythm, it's referred to here as a non-structural glitch. There are several other modifications that Lang makes as this section progresses that are included in my paper, but I won't discuss today for the sake of time. And then, of course, there are the next 2 major sections, which I have also analyzed and are included in my paper, but I won't discuss today. However, after these 3 major sections are presented, this first idea returns. So this first motive of these 3 pairs of notes comes back. However, the contraction glitch is now present between every statement. So there's no silence. It's just one presented right after another with no gaps. And then, so Lang repeats this, he goes through the same process, inserting the gap between each one. However, there's no silence between each statement. And then he removes this contraction glitch completely. So now he repeats the same idea just as we heard it in the very beginning, silence between each statement, inserting the gap between each pair, going through all the possibilities. And now once he reaches the logical conclusion, right, so a gap between all 3 pairs, the piece ends. The piece is finally over. We finally hear silence at the moment where we first heard a contraction glitch. And as he resolves the glitch, the piece ends. So clearly that moment has huge structural significance for Lang. Now, although there are several other musical elements of cheating, lying, stealing whose exploration was beyond the scope of this paper, it is the hope of the author that this writing will stimulate further academic discussion about how composers like David Lang have adapted the language and aesthetics of process-based music like minimalism or serialism in recent decades. Cheating, Lying, Stealing was written almost 30 years ago, 1993, and David Lang's style has certainly evolved greatly since then. So there remains much to explore in regards to how Lang and other composers of a similar aesthetic outlook utilize musical processes while introducing individuality into their work through such mechanisms as this contraction glitch. It would be fruitful for future research to trace Lang's compositional development since then and to ask some of the following questions. What characteristics, if any, remain the same about his use of musical process and glitches in more recent years? Do other works involve these glitches in a way that can be separated into the same sort of structural hierarchy? So are there some that we can look at and say, yes, this clearly has greater structural significance for the work, and others that are not? What other musical features tend to reoccur? So like periodic entrances or abrupt transitions between major sections. The answers to these questions will lead to a deeper understanding of how one of the most prominent living composers today has adapted the music of his minimalist predecessors to create something new and exciting. One thing is certain, we can definitely expect to find plenty of flaws or glitches in his music. Again, as Lang himself said, quote, I think the music is where the glitches are. It's how the things don't work. It's how the math almost works. That's where the music is, I think. Thank you.
Good job, Anush. Good job.
Thank you.
Clarence, you are now up next. So again, take a 45 seconds or so to introduce yourself, and then you can start with your presentation.
Okay. So my name is Clarence Brooks. I'm a history and English rhetoric major, and this is my fourth, or I guess it's my third year at UNT, but it's my final in my bachelor's. And I also kind of like made my paper into the like 12 to 15, so we'll have like a little bit of space. All right. During the Second World War, working women received opportunities, authority, and even praise by occupying public spaces that previously excluded. Spaces often gendered as masculine, such as the military, factories, and bars, required and in some cases became dominated by women in wartime. This also meant that women-loving women had the ability to gather publicly, both seen and unseen, as the war created more ambiguity in the gendering of behavior. Women-loving women responded by forming butch femme culture in bar life and military organizations such as the Women's Army Corps to make one another visible in public. And despite these growing opportunities for women-loving women, institutional medicalization or pathologizing of homosexuality became common, especially in the military. And using personal testimonies and archival materials from the GLBT Historical Society, the National Institute of Health, and the Lesbian Herstory Archive, this paper will consider how women-loving women use space and materiality to evade the totalitizing force of institutional power and render themselves visible in particular circles. And while I examine women-loving women in the WAC particularly, other historians have covered wartime experience of the LGBTQ community in more comprehensive approaches. Alan Berube, in his book Coming Out Under Fire, laid the groundwork for historians studying queer identities in World War II. His work is a foundational look at the structural dynamics of gays in the military and the governmental policing of identity that was increasing as societal anxiety about military sexuality increased. I approach this same anxiety from a slightly different direction. The WAC was a particularly potent site of such anxiety because it was a space where women were entering and operating within an area traditionally deemed masculine, the military. So the socially constructed definitions of gender that I will discuss will be grounded in Judith Butler's exploration of gender in her book Gender Troubles. The anxiety that arose in the heteronormative US public about the WAC was underscored by the negotiation and challenge of strict gender roles that occurred as these women redefined the boundaries of their own gender expressions. Worry arose about the type of women joining the WAC, and historian Marilyn Hegarty has examined how print culture reflected this anxiety at the time. Specifically, there were many public concerns about military women's sexuality as both representative of propriety and promiscuity. There was a great deal of literature distributed to instruct WACs about knowing and controlling sexuality and gender behavior while still maintaining a homosocial culture within the WAC. An informational pamphlet detailing the everydays of WAC life informed new recruits that mannish haircuts were taboo, that it was only supposed to be at your neck and shoulders. So they were regulating physical appearance, but in an evaluation of the presence of homosexuality in the WAC by the Surgeon General, women of masculine dress or appearance were not to be singled out for suspicion solely because of their attire or their behavior. some WACs took on a more masculine performance of self, particularly of body, clothes, and manner, to operate within the cultural logics of those in positions of military power. And the uniform lent itself to a more masculine appearance with the tie and the jacket, and mostly paired with a skirt, but occasionally pants. And the fine line between a functioning military unit and acknowledging the subculture developing within the WAC was one Colonel Hobby operated on throughout her time as the director of the WAC in World War II. To dismiss public accusations of the presence of homosexuality in the WAC, Hobby asked the Surgeon General to conduct an evaluation, and he stated that he believed no course of instruction in the problem was needed, but merely a reference to it in lectures by the psychiatrists. This aligns with literature instructing officers on how to approach the topic of homosexuality should it come up, unacknowledged unless explicitly confessed. So a policy of non-disclosure and subversion contributed to this tentative safety and welcoming environment of the WAC to women loving women during the war. The WAC distributed a pamphlet on sexual health, education, and hygiene that articulated in clear relief their official stance that was echoing like the military's view itself on both the expectation of men's hypersexuality and the follies of homosexuality. The pamphlet was very frank in its endorsement of homosocial behavior within the WAC, describing comradeship between fellow members of the WAC as the finest relationship in companionship working together and preferable to sexual relations with men, but also encouraged each woman to seek like medical or psychological help or assistance if it became a sexual relationship. The pamphlet instructs officers not to make it into a witch hunt, using that very particular vocabulary like witch hunt, and to only seek any sort of action if its manifestations undermine the efficiency of the individuals concerned and the stability of the group. This practice of intentional unacknowledgement seems to be only with women loving women during the time it wasn't present in the rest of the military, supporting the previous notions of silence as evidence of non-existence. And the pamphlet required a great deal of tangible evidence to even bring forth accusation, and even after did not advise immediate dishonorable discharge, but rather a series of steps with like guidance and counseling and transfer before any discharge was advised. And if any direct confrontation could be avoided, it was advised to avoid internal division and to maintain this public perception of heteronormative women only in the Women's Army Corps. At the same time, gatherings of civilian women-loving women moved from more domestic to public spaces like bars. And although they still had to remain in this interim state of ambiguity of knowing and unknowing. One woman, particularly Bonnie, described herself as gay because she participated in the community, not solely because she was sexually attracted to women. And so her identity seemed rooted in knowing and following the cultural logics of Buffalo, like butch femme bar life, rather than just her particular identity of like. So some femmes, she said, weren't lesbians because they didn't follow the rules that were laid out in the community. So this community-driven definition of women living women is intriguing when placed in context to the homosocial behavior described and encouraged by institutionally distributed sexual health pamphlets and other externally written propaganda. The instructional for officers about sexual hygiene described a preventative measure against like homosexual influences by substituting a hero worship type of reaction meant to inspire leadership and guide those attractions into normal fields of expression. This was intended to influence women who were supposedly only engaging in homosexual relationships in lieu of home civilian life. The pamphlet externalizes the reasons for women living women in the WAC onto social environment of only women and many in positions of power. While this is meant to separate individuals from their behavior and imply an ability to normalize women living women, it also reveals the behaviorally dictated subculture present. One one WAC, Pat Bond, described seeing upon entering the mess hall at Fort Oglethorpe all these dykes sitting with their feet up in the fatigues. So the women-loving woman community in the WAC was organized around butchers and their girlfriends, much like the bar life. The WAC offered women the opportunity to engage in professional and public sites, or engage with professional and public sites in a more fluid capacity than if they were in civilians. They could travel together during their time off and participate in programs and celebrations as a group without having to justify their communal behavior. Phyllis Aubrey, a sergeant in the WAC, collected quite a few programs and series of photographs from these events and endeavored travels across the US and Europe. Her section of the WAC was located in Lubbock, where the women would host holiday celebrations and put on performing arts programs. And these programs, while put on by the military, seem to be spaces almost separate from its harsher rules and regulations, offering like this temporary respite in which these women could exist as simply themselves. Another WAC, Lorraine Hurdle, was a member of multiple different sports teams that offered a similar sort of respite, basketball, badminton, softball, all that, where she was able to interact with both military personnel and the local civilians outside of the regulation of military garb. And some of Aubrey's photographs, Phyllis Aubrey's photographs, the way the women carry themselves is much more relaxed than in the set posturing displayed in her photos of military marching. The women are out of uniform, lounging together and laughing. And by removing the rigidity of military distinctions via uniform, the recreational space affords performance of self, one unbound by these external military definitions. And the informational instructing new recruits on acceptable behavior in the WAC had a section on what isn't done in the WAC that prohibited sitting in bars and dancing together and demonstrating affection publicly if they were in uniform. So the uniform dictating behavior is important because it leaves room for WACs to engage in these activities when out of uniform, which is usually in these recreational spaces. And before the WAC joined the Army in 1943, the women could wear any civilian clothing more regularly. So butch women especially could don more masculine clothing in these recreational spaces. During a Halloween celebration, Aubrey herself was described to be dressed as a black garbed witch with her broomstick by a WAC newsletter recounting the event. And Aubrey's costume is not necessarily non-conforming, but was notably reported to other WACs in the newsletter alongside a broader description of the celebration. And this demonstrates the dispersal of community activities afterwards. The temporary relaxing of military rigidity is prolonged by this newsletter's record. And so it was like everyone was sharing with each other. It was kind of this like, internal like, memorializing of everybody's activities. And a group photo of this Halloween event displays other women in various costumed attire, including a couple in drag and others in pants or dresses. And the ability to perform a variety of identities during these recreational times allowed for gender non-conforming identities to play out in ways otherwise impermissible in military uniform. The fluidity of self in a costumed Halloween celebration or a musical theatrical performance left room for the ambiguity needed for women-loving women to render themselves visible to each other, but not to institutional surveillance. So clothing and affectation, traditionally gender masculine, could be worn and embodied without negative retribution because the strictures of behavior were lifted in these temporary spaces of celebration and relaxation. The traveling that the WACs were able to do, as documented by Aubrey's photographs, seemed to be almost of a tourist-like tonality. And so Aubrey collected this postcard from Carlsbad Caverns and a program from the opera in Paris when she went over after the war ended to like help with cleanup. And many of the photos from her travels showed her in both civilian and military clothing, relaxed in posture and wrapped around other WACs in front of famous landmarks. And the photographs memorialized both the adventure of travel and the closeness of the women together. The program that Aubrey kept from the opera performance had this apology for the ruined landscape and an offer for opportunities available that are solely for like through the U.S. Army, like 3 nightclubs, university courses, professional gatherings, and free sightseeing tours. So even in the immediate aftermath of the war during cleanup, the military provided these women something that developing bar life back home could not. This mobility unhindered by societal expectations of travel. They could travel together unquestioned because of the already established connection of the Women's Army Corps, of all of them being together. And then even further in terms of mobility, Aubrey, she obtained her driver's license through her time in the WAC in Lubbock, and then this nurse, Winifred Briggs, described many of her wartime experiences of downtime as drunk as a skunk, but still with the same sort of maneuverability in public all over Europe and the US because of her association with the military. The occupation of public space as both military and women-loving women made the WAC and other military branches so appealing for the 1940s women-loving women community, even in the face of the tightening institutional repression. The WAC was more separate in location and practices from the civilian population than the contemporary bar life, and so held a limited safety for women-loving women to exist and flourish under the military's radar. So women-loving women in the military had an additional pressure of military surveillance, even within the spaces they could safely exist, like recreation. They had to find ways to be unnoticeably noticeable, and could do so by using particular linguistic vernacular. Colloquial conversations and markers operated as signifying ways to exist under the radar while still being able to make oneself visible to other women. In the mess hall scene that I described above from Pat Bond, Pat recounted hearing one butch woman shout out, "Hey, Henry, pass the salt," to another WAC. And the nicknames that women-loving women gave themselves and others were one way they could express very gendered identities in military spaces. Lorraine Hurdle served in the WAC during the Second World War and after on into like the 50s in the Korean War. And she collected over the war years all these letters from officers, civilians, and other WACs that documented her time from outside sources. And each individual group used all these like distinct nicknames and particular monikers that indicated both her own identity and positionality as well as Hurdle's. One of them, she was very insistent about how Jack Hurdle remembered their day and the day that they met and all these different recollections, and each person seemed to also attach like an address and a phone number and that sort of thing of like, remember, come find me. So it was a both record of like social and also romantic, like as a catalog of all these different relationships. So the performance and regulations of gender nonconforming identities of women-loving women in the WAC manifested differently in professional, recreational, and domestic spaces, inhabiting temporary spaces to build community and find love. During the war, the military as an institution contributed to the pathologization of homosexuality and as such sought punitive measures in response to women-loving women or to their discovery. However, the Women's Army Corps was unique in the contradictory allowance and in some cases encouragement of homosocial relationships among WACs. Recreation and travel through the WAC offered temporary spaces to cultivate a women-loving women community that was distanced from the public eye in a way that contemporary bar life was not. And women-loving women in the Women's Army Corps subverted the harshly regulated space of the military to exist in duality, seen by other women-loving women and unseen, purposely or not, by institutional power. Thank you.
Great.
All right. So I'm Sarah, and I'm in a similar situation where this is my third year at UNT, but I'm graduating and I'm double majoring in creative writing and in history, and so that's kind of how I got into this project, trying to combine both of those disciplines. Um, it's something that I'm really passionate about, finding ways to take like really academic information and convey it in a way that can entertain a public. So what I kind of ended up doing is working on this novel that's actually like geared more towards like middle grade, like young adult readers. Um, and so I am probably just going to read the first chapter for today, which is about 5 pages double spaced. Just so I don't go over the time. It should take me about 10 minutes. And then I'll just like explain where the rest of the plot is going. So here we go with the first chapter. Ruby and Ashana have covered the parlor with color. They gathered armfuls of flowers from Ruby's mother's garden and tossed them like snow across the rugs and sofas. They snuck sweets from the kitchen and spread them across the coffee table, set with Ruby's favorite teapot ready to brew. Ruby wrangled the fluffy white family dog named Snowball, while Ishana tied a sunset pink bow around the animal's neck. Everything had to be bright and interesting and welcoming, because finally Ruby's big brother Wesley was coming home to India, finally and for good. As Ruby gritted her teeth to keep a struggling Snowball still, she saw her mother pass by the parlor doors. She'd swept her chestnut hair back into a bun and put on one of her nicest dresses, one she said her mother took her to pick out in London for a party years and years ago. Her mother smiled the sort of smile that said she wouldn't tell, but that if Ruby's father saw the state of the room, Ruby would be dead. Because worst of all, Ruby and Ashana snuck around the back of the house to where their mother kept barrels of fabric, barrels of dye. Ruby had to resist the desire to dip her pale 10-year-old girl arms into the dark waters to pull out the cloths they had started soaking 2 days before. Her mother would know she'd interrupted the process. Her arms would be stained past her elbows. Ishana skipped ahead of her friend into the line that hung from the house to the gardening shed, strung up with colorful fabrics their mothers would soon sell at the market. Her hands brushed a tapestry with a spiraling design that reminded Ruby of a galaxy. It was dyed green with swashes of a majestic purple, Ruby and Ashana's favorite colors respectively. Ishana ran the cloth through her hands and she breathed, "Can you believe we made this? Is like, what are those you have in the pond? What sort of lily?" Ruby shook her head. "I don't know," she laughed, "but I know my father will grit his teeth when he sees them in the house. And I know your Mata will love how the colors turned out." The girls jumped up and stretched their arms to the pins holding the tapestry to the line. They each grabbed a few, and they shrieked and laughed when it fell on top of them. Ruby's world was shadowy with green like a forest, until Ishana lifted the tapestry above their heads like a tent, and she grinned. It always made Ruby happy when Ishana smiled big at her. She wouldn't do it for a long time because of the gap between her front teeth. But once Ruby found out, she pulled down her lower lip to show the twists in her own teeth, and they laughed like sisters since. Ruby thought Ishana was pretty. Her hair was darker than Ruby's, thicker and silkier, and when she braided it with wildflowers, it looked like the night sky. Her eyelashes were long and her lips were full and the color of milk tea, except for the kind Ishana liked, which was almost the color of just milk. Ruby had always received wonder and compliments on the auburn tints in her thin hair and the grayness of her eyes, but to her, Ishana was a classic beauty, the kind that everyone in Kerala, even the British ladies, would look twice at. The girls were always quite the sight whenever they went into town together. For a moment, under that tapestry, the shadows felt like too much for Ruby. Her breath caught in her throat and she pressed her lips hard. Bad things her father said. Things about how soon Ishana's beauty would sweep her away and how Ruby would need to start socializing more with the other daughters of the medics and generals. Ruby didn't have a problem with those girls. They were nice enough. But they wouldn't make tapestry tents or dig up bugs while their mothers thought they were tending to the flowers. The only languages they wished to trade with her were French and Latin, nothing with a completely different alphabet like Hindustani. Ruby, having lived her whole life in the Kerala countryside, only wanted to see more of the world with which she had been teased but never allowed to fully experience. The other girls always dreamed of Europe, just like Wesley. But Wesley was coming home. Ruby and Ishana carried the tapestry inside. Ruby wanted to toss it over the one that her father had hung on the wall. She'd always been creeped out by St. Francis in blessing all the people in their drab robes and shallow faces. If he was able to help them, why not give them a bit of cake? But Ishana had enough reason to at least point out that they couldn't reach over the tapestry, let alone fix it to the wall. They took their creation and instead tossed it between two armchairs, again like a tent. Ruby didn't say it, but just like how she and Wesley used to do. That was when she was a baby, though, before Wesley got sucked into schoolwork, before he earned his way into fancy British schools all the way back in London. Ruby couldn't recall when he got his letter from Westminster Academy, but she remembered how he wouldn't stop talking about it for the weeks after, begging their parents to send them sooner than the school year. Ruby didn't remember it either, but her mother always said that Wesley had been unhappy about their move to India, always missing their town home on some London square, always asking when they would go back. Wesley earned his way to London again. He earned his way for 6 years. But for reasons no one would tell her, Ruby's brother was coming home a little over a month before the year ended, and that was after the months it took to sail across the globe. Ishana had been twisting the ends of the tapestry between her thin fingers, but she stopped twirling it to ask, "Ruby, when is your brother getting in again?" Ruby blinks, drawing herself out of her thoughts. "My father said they would be home before dinner." But outside the open parlor windows, the sun had already begun to sink, painting the sky with the orange hues of which Ishana's Mata was always so envious. She tried time and time again to capture India's paler colors, the in-between shades of sunsets and river mists, but the dyes always insisted on shocking her. India seemed ever insistent on shocking. Whenever Ruby more than glances out the window, she gets caught up in the great green curves and the emerald trees that splatter the landscape. Her favorite views are this time of year, when all the yellow and purple wildflowers begin to bloom. One look out the window, and she had a hard time imagining why her brother would rather return to a cold, rainy northern island when he could climb out his window at night and explore their native country. Ishana's hands fall on Ruby's arm. "I'm sure they're all right," she says. "The monsoons have not even begun." Ruby wasn't worrying about Wesley's travel, although maybe she should have, but rather about what her brother would think of her, if he would still want to paint with her, if he'd still read her stories beneath blanket tents. Those are memories, no matter how faint, that Ruby cannot let go. Her mother said that when she was little, she'd cry for her papa at night. If not for her father, no one but Wesley would calm her down. But Ishana smiles at her, and Ruby knows to swallow her worries. Ishana has never even met Wesley. By the time she and her mother came to work extra jobs at their house, Ruby had already started a collection of letters with her brother. And Wesley had never been mean to anyone, but with all his talk about loving his country, and he meant Britain, Ruby still worries that Wes won't understand it here. "I'm excited for you to meet him. Maybe if Ruby says it, it won't be so scary. I bet he'll have loads to teach us, and maybe we can maybe we can make him pick up some Hindustani." "Ooh," Ishana claps her hands together and her braid bounces with her. "Do you think they taught him Sanskrit? I'd love to learn it. No one will teach me, well, because, you know." Ruby did know. Ishana and her mother are Sudras, members of one of the lower castes. In India, most all of the people who weren't British were aligned with one caste or another as a sort of way to organize people by how much money and what kind of job they had. The only problem was that you couldn't change where you fit. You were born into it, and you could only do things within your caste. So Ishana, who wanted to be a priestess, never could because she was born in a caste of common people. It always meant that it was harder for her to get an education that would teach her things such as Sanskrit. Ruby's mother taught both the girls about subjects she knew. She had once been a governess in her youth, and therefore she was qualified by British standards to teach young girls things such as English and French, drawing, music, and embroidery, a subject which both girls found strenuously long and dull compared to the thrill of dunking the fabrics in different dyes and watching them come out beautiful without another touch. Ruby had never asked Wesley in her letters if he was taught Sanskrit. He often wrote about Greek and Latin, sometimes teaching her simple words or phrases through the mail. So she just tells Ishana, "Maybe." Snowball leaps to her feet and runs out of the parlor yapping. Both girls look to the front window. Carriages, 2 of them. Big ones with horses stomping in the June heat. Ruby's heart pounds in her chest. One of those carriages holds her brother, the brother she hasn't seen in years, the brother who grew up in a far and distant land, the brother who she's written but not seen. What if he thinks she's ugly? What if he's ashamed to have her as a little sister rather than a little brother? What if he thinks she's stupid? She squeezes Ishana's hand. She can't even remember when she grabbed it, but Ishana squeezes back. The girls share a glance and they both manage a smile. Feet stomp in the hallway and someone calls, Ishana, come. It's her Mata. She switches into Hindustani to add, to give them space. Ishana grew up learning a lot of English and Hindustani, but her Mata learned English when she was much older than the girls. She switches back and forth between the languages a lot. Berube, growing up around Ishana, her Mata, and other Hindi people, picked up a decent amount of the language, especially with Ishana's help. And she doesn't want Ishana to go. She wants to have a friend, someone who feels like a sister when she again meets her brother. She wants to hold on tight when Ishana lets go of her hand, but she doesn't. Ishana's Mata is right. Ruby has to go to her brother alone. Ishana's Mata smiles softly at Ruby as she wraps her arm around her daughter. Jao, she says, nodding encouragement. See you, Bahi. So that's my first chapter. And from there, the brother comes back. It's Wesley. And he's actually accompanied by his friend, who is a girl his age. He's about 16, who has been deemed like mad, like a mad woman. And they're a family friend, and they want Ruby's father, who's a medic, to try to heal her with the magical India wildlife air and all that. And when he comes back, though, things aren't as Ruby hoped they would. And some of the things that she'd worried about, like him rejecting her and rejecting her friends and rejecting just the country that she grew up in, because it's not Britain, some of those worst fears kind of come true. And she ends up in a weird position where she's trying to reconcile the fact that this is her brother and she wants to love him and have a relationship with him. But at the same time, this is a culture that she also kind of grew up in India, and she wants to appreciate and respect that and still continue to have those relationships that she has built throughout her childhood. So that's where the whole plot goes.
Good job, Sarah. Well, I'm going to start with the questions, if you all don't mind. I will start with Anuj. In the way you described Lang's work, it sounds like it is similar to some jazz musicians, and how jazz transitions often seem awkward in tone and sound. Is that an accurate comparison?
Well, so okay, I'm going to preface everything I say with a very famous quote by a composer that said, "Writing about music is like dancing about architecture." It just, So with that in mind, listening to a jazz tune and deciding whether a transition is smooth or awkward, is a very, very subjective approach. And I think in Lang's work, when his transitions, I think, are more influenced from rock music, actually. So there's obviously a lot of background that I, of course, didn't have the time to include today, but that is included in my paper. So one of the features of totalism, which is a stylistic movement that at least Lang's work in the 90s could sort of loosely be categorized with, features a heavy influence from rock music. So he actually has like a kick drum, like a rock kick drum in this piece, which is highly unusual for a piece of concert music, something that's going to be heard in a concert hall, right? And so the transitions in his work are often very much like you'd hear in like a rock song or like a classic, and to the extent that, yeah, I mean, jazz and rock do have a common root. They do share a common ancestor, right? I mean, if you go far back enough, it all kind of comes back, to the same place. But I don't think that transitions, because in jazz it's usually very focused on harmony. It's very focused on harmonic progressions. This chord goes to that chord, and I think in Lang's work, the ontological direction doesn't come so much from harmony as it does from these sort of overall, these larger processes, sort of in a minimalist style. And so I think for Lang, those transitions are more like, here's this huge section that's 2 or 3 minutes long where I'm working with this process, and there's I have this thing that I'm doing and I'm manipulating it. A few seconds of silence, and then a complete transition to a totally different idea that seems absolutely unrelated. I think in even in a jazz tune, when it transitions, usually, and we're speaking of course broadly about just the kind of most formulaic jazz tune. I mean, even there's this idea that whatever comes next is somehow related to what came before, even if it's by way of contrast, even if it's by way of complementing the melodic idea or the harmonic progression or something from the beginning. So I think yes, but maybe tangentially, maybe through that sort of maybe through that common influence of rock music, you could make a case for it. Someone with a much deeper background in jazz would have to answer that question, I think, more fully than I could.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, my last question for you is, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that there really hasn't been a lot of work on Lang, a lot of analysis. So is this your career? Is this where you're headed to become Lang's somehow authorized ethno-music biographer of some kind?
Well, it's funny because I definitely consider myself a composer first and a theorist second, and this would sort of fall under the theorist category. But it's really funny because this in June, actually, I was invited to go to Yale as a composer for their summer festival with a handful of like 3 or 4 other composers to work with David Lang and the other faculty there to write a piece. So I was going to meet him and like work with him on a piece and like take lessons with him, as a composer and everything. And then of course, it's all been canceled now. But it's really funny because I kind of wanted to ask him some of these questions myself and sort of, see what he thought basically about my interpretations, because it's all, one of the reasons there isn't much writing in general about 21st century composers is it's sort of like the Wild West. There's not really a lot to go. You're kind of just out there in the dark. You're the first person talking about, a composer that's still alive. And it's like, you just have no idea if what you're saying is, coherent with their vision of their own work. And does that even matter? A lot of theorists would say, no, it doesn't really matter what the composer thinks. If you find the sort of evidence for what you're saying, then it really doesn't matter. So it's kind of like the Wild West. And as a composer, part of your job is to study, composers that you like anyways. So I'm not sure that I see myself sort of falling down the theory rabbit hole and writing analytical essays, my future. Like I said, I definitely see myself as a composer first, but I definitely will not stop studying his music. So.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, Clarence, I have 2 questions for you. You mentioned, and I was following along in your paper as you were reading, the Surgeon General's position that you talked about, Colonel Hobby, seemed pretty similar to a don't ask, don't tell policy that President Clinton finally made official in the 1990s. Did I hear you, and did I read that correctly?
Yeah, it's a pretty similar mentality, and it was very particular, I think, because like in this time during like the Second World War, there was this kind of like tightening of like kind of moving it from like judicial and like disciplinary repression into more like medicalization. and the military was kind of like working with like psychiatry during this point, but then like specifically only like women loving women, they were just kind of like, if we don't do anything about it, if we don't like address it, then we don't have to, we can like pretend it doesn't actually exist. But yeah, so it's pretty similar to the don't ask, don't tell sort of thing.
So, all right, how much has been written on women loving women and the Black during World War II? Are you kind of the first to explore this?
There's been more like, so I mentioned Alan Berube, and so there's a lot of like, when people like write about like queer wartime, it's kind of like overarching, and there were some where it was like specific to like women loving women's history, but it would like span from like the 40s and 50s, that sort of thing. So I feel like this like very specific look at only women loving women, I think, is not as like, you know, fleshed out. Like there's so much like personal records that need to be like, you know, looked through and, you know, analyzed and like shared with the public, because there's so many stories that like haven't been shared yet.
Okay, so if I am a U.S. history professor, which I am, and I wanted to create a unit on the LGBTQ plus experience in the 20th century, typically I would start with the Stonewall Riots.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing you say is I should start with women loving women in Black during World War II.
I mean, I suppose you could. There's a lot of like it's the sort of like discontent and like, you know, like dissonance, I guess, of like going to war and finding this kind of like almost like, you know, separate space to kind of exist outside of this, you know, like immediate pressures of like civilian life, and then coming back into this very like, you know, harsh reality, I guess, of the 50s, where everyone was kind of trying to reestablish this very heteronormative, you know, nuclear family, that sort of like these traditional values sort of thing. I think that kind of like discontinuity really like pushed a lot of like the like 50s and 60s kind of like, you know, discontent, where they're like, we're not going to stand for this anymore. I don't know. So I mean, there's like, even before that, like the 30s and like the First World War, like it you know, you just like can keep going back. But yeah, I feel like it would be good to include.
Okay, all right. Well, Sarah, where does your story originate? That I was taking notes while you were reading, and I was following along because I have your story or your story. Where did this come from?
Where did it come from? Well, I knew that I wanted to do an undergraduate research fellowship, and I thought I wanted to do it with a creative writing professor because I wanted to do like a creative piece. But then I ended up talking with Dr. Aimee, and I had taken her British Raj class, and I really liked that. And a lot of the themes in the whole story come from the research that I did in her class. We had like a research paper, and mine was focused on like women in India and how like white women, like British women, interacted with the actual like Indian women, and how sometimes that was helpful, sometimes that was hurtful. And a little tinge of it came also from, I took it was in the fall, it was fall 2019. I took Nora Gilbert's Gaslighting in Victorian Literature and Film. And so a lot of the ideas about like women in that time period of like the early 1800s, a lot of those themes came from there, and that kind of frustration of like being a woman and being in this period where like men are going out and constantly colonizing. So I think a lot of it came from there. And then also I mentioned earlier, I want to write, but I want to write for younger people. But I also had this side of me that's really passionate about education and academia. And so like I want to combine those so that like younger people get to kind of learn in a way that's entertaining. It's also like able to reach their level, but like not address them like their kids, if that makes sense. So it's a combination of a lot of things, but those were probably the main three.
Okay. Well, we are actually 4 minutes late, but I'm going to give someone an opportunity to ask one more question. I know Miss Dunkpile is in the room. It looks like we have a Kelly in the room and a Kimberly in the room. Or the three presenters can ask one question of.
Thanks for getting cold.
So we got time for one question.
I want to know, I loved all of your presentations. Sarah, I want to know if you can tell us the ending of this story. I'm an avid reader, and I don't know if I can go the rest of my life not knowing the ending of this.
Okay. So a lot of the middle of the book focuses on they try to help Wesley, who's the older brother, and the family friends that he brings back with him. They're trying to help them adjust. And there's actually, you don't really see it in the first chapter, but there's actually like a magical realism twist that has to do with like interacting with like the foundational literature of different cultures. So like for like the Hindu people, that would be like the Ramayana, or like for the like Wesley's really big on like Greek and Roman stuff, so that might be like Achilles or Hercules, or like stories like that. So there's like a magical realism element where they're actually like able to interact with these stories, and that's kind of what has messed with the one girl who's the family friend, who they think is like mad. That's actually what's kind of like disturbed her, and so they're helping her heal from that by using the stories of like both of their cultures, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And like I don't want to like, I can like go on and on and on. I don't want to like, take up everyone's day, but that's like my short version. So
Awesome.
Well, gang, these were awesome. I am so glad that you participated today. I enjoyed reading your documents, your papers this weekend, and so I kind of formulated a few questions if you couldn't figure that out. But even what you said today prompted additional questions, and so that's always a good thing when your audience and your readers have questions to further explore the topic. That means you have done a good job. And so I just want to commend you. I hope you continue pursuing these topics, and hopefully with Dr. Ime. Anush, who was your advisor?
Dr. Schwartz.
Dr. Schwartz. I hope that the three of you continue to work with your advisors to get publications, perhaps, out of this wonderful work that you've done. So congratulations, and thank you for presenting.